We're the book friends that think good.
What does this mean for our life, for our world? Yiggity yeet, my dude. I'm happy to speak. Always happy to think.
I don't know how to do that. I can look into that.
Makes you sound like a book friend that can think good.
It's Jack and it's Weston.
BFTTGs. Yeah.
Jack, I think good. Sometimes I good think, too.
Makes you sound pretty good.
We might want to make it more concise. We're going to attempt to grapple and answer 3 questions. Number 1, what did we learn? Number 2, what did we disagree with? And number 3, what are we going to do about it? I am ready to roll.
I'm in it. Weston, my book friend, tell me, what book is it that we're thinking good about today?
Send it.
Today. We are talking about Chapter 5 of the Field Guide to Lies in Statistics.
How numbers are collected.
Thank you, Jack. How numbers are collected.
And they be collected badly.
Yes. Jack, run us through the subheadings.
Okay, great. So Levitin talks all about the ways in which statistics are collected in this chapter, as it states in the title. And some of the specific ways that he gets into in terms of he basically addresses concepts of how data is collected and talks about how those things can go awry and why we need to think critically about those things. So the first thing he talks about is sampling. The second thing he talks about after sampling is he talks about sampling for a while. It's a large opening section. There's a lot of good stuff there. He talks about sampling biases. He talks about specific sampling biases. So he talks about participation bias. He talks about reporting bias. He talks about lack of standardization. He talks about measurement error. He talks about definitions in sampling. And then he talks about things that are unknowable or unverifiable. To kind of end this section on how data is collected. So I thought it was a very interesting chapter. There's a lot in here I really agreed with. And this chapter made me laugh out loud on several occasions as I was reading it. Just thought he had some really poignant asides in here that were just great. One of the things that made me laugh when I was reading it was he said, if you don't disclose how you selected your sample, no one will know. I just love he gets kind of cheeky on some of the stuff.
That's interesting. I read it in a very different tone.
Oh yeah.
Even that one that you just mentioned, I was reading that as him being very cynical.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of how I interpreted the chapter.
Yeah.
To where you just said something where you're there's a lot of good stuff or whatever. And I agree that there's a lot of good stuff here, but I was just I kind of left the chapter feeling very disheartened about, literally.
I'll say this. Yeah, I'll say the same thing. After reading this chapter, I was like, ooh, they be lying about everything.
Yeah.
Everyone is lying about everything. Because here's the thing that I kind of felt like this kind of sums up my feelings on the chapter after reading it. On page 80, he has this quote that says, it starts to feel like we will have to sample all the rocks on the moon to get a good analysis.
Yeah.
Which is kind of a metaphor or analogy for saying we need to ask everybody because there's so many variables in sampling. And I did think, as I was reading it, I was like, man, there are a lot of variables to consider, because he does a good job asking critical questions of samples to a degree that I wouldn't have thought of on my own at all. He gets into he gets so deep into subcategories and cross sections and variables that I left the chapter feeling also very discouraged about statistics in general and just reporting and just thinking man, I think I felt discouraged, but also encouraged to think more critically and to just ask who says, or I think the important question for me from this section was, he says, like, whenever you hear a statistic like 71% of the British are in favor of something, you should ask, yes, but 71% of what, which British?
Yeah. Yep.
Which I think is a really good, especially like when he gets into American cross sectionality, like it's even more pronounced. Like, okay, 84% of Americans love this. According to who? And what do you mean when you say American?
And what do you mean when you say love?
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Like, there's just so many, like, I came away thinking there's so many different ways that you can unintentionally mess up that, like, I don't know how you're supposed to, like, truly trust in anything, any numbers that you've seen, especially on subjective areas, you know, like, especially on things where it's like an opinion poll. Like, this is garbage. It's just garbage.
Yeah.
But it also made me think about back to our book Sapiens a little bit, like how we evolved and stuff, and how we, like, you know, have grown as a species. And it made me think, like, not only, like, yes, numbers are factual, but it's like it's so hard for people on the aggregate to, like, grasp just numbers in general. I mean, think about it, dude. We didn't have a number system with a 0 in it until, like, 1,000 years ago ish, right? Maybe 2,000 years ago.
Yeah,
like
something like that. Recent.
We didn't think of 0 until then, and it's just there's so many things based around 0 now. Like, yeah, it's kind of more proof. This chapter made me think about how, like, we really are just animals, and, like, this, like, I don't know. Like, made me think about that a little bit, I guess.
I'm gonna stick to my little oasis and just I can know it. Yeah. I mean, I think there is this thing about, like, we're probing into the unknown. I was reading a totally different book that's not a field guide to lies and statistics, but the point that the author was making in the chapter I most recently read was technology touches on a deep desire, and that desire is for us to do magic, because magic gives us whatever we want with no effort. And he says basically that's what our technology is designed to do. And I thought that was a really great point this author was making, just about, like, how, like, what technology touches on in us and what it fulfills. And I think it coincided really, really well with what we're reading in FGLS, because I was just thinking about, like, yeah, like, man, we're doing it's kind of that age old thing of, like, they were so busy wondering if they could, they didn't ask if they should. Right. Like, I kind of think that sometimes with all of the data we're collecting, like, should we become so reliant on these techniques, statistics and probability?
You don't think about that, like, constantly, though?
I do. No, I do. But, like, this book just drives it home because of how much error there is in the whole system.
No, I literally think about it, like, just not even statistic or math things. I'm thinking, like, wait, why am I playing Pokemon right now? I was so busy wondering whether I could play Pokemon that I didn't consider whether I should be, right?
Should I be, like, doing this?
So I feel like so many of our actions are, like, fall into that category. But, dude, anyways,
I was on a Zoom call for work today. It dropped about 4 times. Right? Like, Wi-Fi was, like, spotty, in and out, kept dropping. I was in a building that I'm unfamiliar with, so I don't know if it was the Wi-Fi network there or if it was the Wi-Fi network on the other side. And the person I was on the Zoom call with, we're, like, chatting back and forth, like, is it me or is it you? Like, I don't know. And I was just thinking about that and this book, and thinking about my most recent drive over to the West Side with my dad, who was saying, like, can you believe they want semis to be self-driving? Have you thought about how often technology fails? And I'm like, oh man, yes. Like, I mean, just the fact that, like, we can't hold a Zoom call consistently without error. Hardly ever. Like, it's crazy the things that we want to just rely on whole hog.
See, it's funny. I don't know. I kind of disagree with that sentiment, though, because I would just argue back. Yes, it needs to be in place, but can you believe they want to do it? Like, yeah, and of course they're going to be. Because humans make way more mistakes than than a machine will once we get it right, you know?
That's true. That's true. Also, a mistake that somebody else makes or that impacts somebody else doesn't. We talked about this when we read Atomic Habits a little bit. How like negative impacts on others are not as strong as negative impacts on self. So like I think he talked about that when he talked about making it unpleasant, like when he's talking about like making things pleasing or displeasing. Like things are much stronger when they negatively impact you than when they negatively impact somebody else or future you or something like that. Like, yeah. I think that's part of the problems with data is like we convince ourselves that like, especially as more and more decisions are made based on things like statistics and polls, like consequential decisions, like who runs the country, for instance, or, you know, should we implement X or Y energy system, whatever, like as more of those things become like more and more data and statistics and probability driven, like we can fake ourselves out into sort of thinking like, oh, it's just number crunching. But it's like every number that goes in, every data point that's collected impacts decisions that impact people. And so like the collecting of data is something that people should treat very, very highly. But I think it's just like, we're so like churn and burn that it's like, whatever, forget about it. Like,
I don't know.
We can't think about all the errors.
Well, I don't know.
I
agree with your point that is how decisions are being made. I disagree with the premise that that's how they should be being made, which I think you would agree with. But
yeah,
like
I think it just increases the onus on us to think critically about this stuff.
Yeah, well, like, in another sense, that's exactly what technology and that's what numbers do too, right? They're not putting the onus on us. We're putting the blame on the numbers. I made this decision because these are the numbers I saw, instead of like these are the logical reasons I would do that. Granted, you could say the numbers are the logical reasons, but it's doing the same thing you're talking about with technology, taking the blame or taking the responsibility off of us. We want that magic, and in a lot of ways, statistics can be that magic where we're just like, well, look, here's the argument. Here's all the numbers.
Yeah.
So if you're mad about it, be mad at the numbers, you know? Don't hate the player, hate the game.
Well, I don't know. Maybe we should get into the book a little bit, but
you mentioned page 80. I did have something. I had a learning before that on page 77.
Okay. Yeah, let's talk about what'd you learn?
What is a teetotaler?
Oh, teetotaler. That's a person who the totality of what they drink is tea. I think that's what that means. But it's like where that comes from. But like what it means is a person who like doesn't drink any alcohol or like use any, like it's like a viceless person.
Yeah, it's like a straight. I was thinking straight edge, but I didn't know what that meant.
Exactly.
I didn't hear about teetotaler.
Yeah, that's what our grandparents called straight edge.
Yeah, they don't spell it TEA, so I didn't think about that.
Yeah,
it's interesting. That was learning.
I had a funny one like that, but I think it was maybe on a different chapter. A funny like little language thing. Anyway, pretty funny. One of the here was a learning for me. Did you have more to that, or was that just your?
No, I just had never heard that word, so I looked it up.
Yeah. A learning for me was about I guess it was just like I mean, I knew that this was a possibility, but just something that I was like, oh man, I guess I didn't think about all of the implications that this can have, where he talks about on page 81, he says, and more frequently than pollsters like to admit, people sometimes give intentionally wrong answers.
Oh yeah.
I thought that was a really funny, like, that's a funny confounding variable. Cause like, I mean, what can you ever do about that? Like he gives the innocuous example of magazines where it's like, well, people want to say they read the Atlantic so that they look smart, but they really read Us Weekly. But then he gives like the like very serious answer about like, you know, who are you voting for? And people just say things to like be radical and like, I don't know, challenge assumptions or something like that. Or if it's clear that the pollster is like leaning a certain direction, they want to say the opposite.
Well, because there's also a facet of that that I don't know. I don't remember if he mentions this, but it's also like people probably just want to stay private. Like there are people that want privacy,
Yeah.
and so they'll just lie to protect their own privacy.
He did talk about that. Like if you ask people like, have you ever cheated on your taxes? People are like, well, I don't trust that this is confidential. So I mean, I'm not gonna say yes. Right.
Yeah, where was that? I forgot about that section.
I think that was maybe in the same. Is that I don't know if that was reporting bias. I think it was participation bias, maybe. No.
They talked about the Harvard thing.
Yeah. I thought that was interesting to consider, like people who graduated from Harvard, they're talking about their salaries, and like people who would be homeless after graduating from Harvard, like not being able to participate because they have no address. It's like, yeah, that is a good point. Like,
yeah, my next learning wasn't until page 88. So did you have anything?
Nope.
Okay, so I guess it wasn't really a learning. It was another one of those things where it's like this book has done a lot of reminding, right? But and I don't know, you're probably not going to remember this at all, but reporting bias just reminded me. I kind of had this flood of memories about the problem of testimony, and that's a problem that's recognized within the philosophical study of epistemology, which is just how we know what we know. And I have thought it's funny ever since I studied that problem. Just, the problem of testimony is basically what do you do with testimony, what people tell you, and taking that as fact. Like how often should you take that as fact? When, how can you decipher when you shouldn't take it as fact?
Yeah.
So then like things
That's
that you hear
question.
from other people, should you take it as a fact and should you know it? Or like, are you going to throw it out? When, how often,
Yeah.
it's the problem. It's a problem with that concept. But then it just made me think too of like people that claim to rely all of their knowledge just on like science and cold hard facts. And it's like how much faith they don't realize that they're putting into things, right?
Yeah.
They're putting like, I don't know, I guess I'm approaching this as like a man of faith because I've been approached several times or had several discussions, right? For the people like, well, you just rely on faith and I'm relying on fact. And I'm like, yeah, but you're relying on faith in that fact that might not be true in so many ways.
Yeah.
But so anyways, it just made me think of that's kind of a funny idiosyncrasy that you can go back and forth on.
Yeah.
Within that
I thought it was interesting, like measurement error. He talks about measurement error. And one of the examples he uses is the IQ test. I think like if anything is objective, like the IQ test has been one that's been like lifted up as an objective measure of intelligence. Lifted up,
but man, I don't know if have you ever seen it administered? Have you ever?
No, I've never taken one or no.
So I have done that, and I've witnessed a lot of that in school.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh yeah. Sure.
Because at least here it's called COGAT, which is cognitive something. But it's an IQ test, and it's what they use to test kids for like high cap programs. And there are a lot of objective answers to subjective questions.
Yeah.
In those sorts of things. So I'd say it's heavily flawed as like a catch-all.
Yeah.
It's good for seeing, different. I would say I like it for seeing processing time.
Yeah.
Seeing like, okay, this kid processes things very quickly, or they don't process it very quickly. But in terms of like an overall like measurement of intelligence, I think it's absolute garbage.
Well, is it like the SAT where like a lot of it is like analogies and like?
I mean,
oh, okay.
No, it's not like the SAT at all. It's Well, I don't know, not like at all. I mean, it's a test in a room
Yeah.
on, paper, but it's more open-ended questions
Mm,
typically. Sometimes
hmm.
they'll include some
That's
multiple
interesting.
choice in the ones that I've seen,
Mm,
but it's more, it's more like not exactly, but kind of like Rorschach tests
oh, okay.
where they'll give you, you'll look and you'll see a bunch of objects, and then
Yeah.
they'll take one out and say, what's the one that should go in there?
Oh,
Right. So kind of pattern recognition is like what a lot of them are. Um,
interesting. Like spatial.
it's more, yeah,
Hmm,
it's more pattern recognition, spatial awareness, and like logic
interesting.
puzzles
Yeah.
rather
Yeah. Logic.
than what the
Yeah.
SAT is like.
Yeah. Huh.
But
That's
anyways,
interesting.
go on. So you were saying,
Oh, but I just thought measurement error was
yeah,
interesting with the IQ test because, like, you think of something as that has been used as much as the IQ test for objective goals, right? Like, it determines where kids go in school. Like, if they're in quote, regular classes or different classes, whether high cap or low or whatever. But he makes the point of like, well, intelligence isn't objective. Like intelligence is a very squishy like concept. There's spatial intelligence, there's emotional intelligence, there's artistic intelligence, there's mathematical intelligence. And that's just a really interesting comment from a neuroscientist
mm-hmm.
to like take something that is viewed by so many in the public and in the professional sectors that where those kind of things matter, um, say that this is really not even an objective measurement, not something that can be objectively measured. I mean, and maybe he would disagree with that, like he would say all of these things can be objectively measured. I don't know, um but yeah, just kind of interesting to think about like how often we have things that may not really be measurable. And I thought the most interesting section for me personally was definitions, because I think that gets to a lot of this error. Um, like the example he uses where he talks about politics, like he said nothing is more politicized than, well, politics. And he uses the example, let's say this imaginary politician Alicia Florrick is like divisive. And you just ask the question of voters, is there anything at all that you disagree with or disapprove of in anything the candidate has said, even if you support her? And everybody will have a gripe. And then you collect this number. Well, 80% of people disapprove of Florrick. And I think that that's so interesting to think about, like how, again, this is like specious subdividing,
Yeah,
right? But it's done with narrative,
yeah,
by way of numbers. And that's just really interesting to see how that can be done. Like, oh, well, instead of calling it like, you know, instead of saying that people aren't voting for or supporting this candidate, we'll say that they disapprove of this candidate with no asterisk that says on one issue, right? Or whatever.
yeah. I mean, yeah. Yeah, I kept thinking through this chapter too, how many of these flaws are within standardized testing and why I hate standardized testing for kids.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because I mean, dude, just go through, definitions for sure. Measurement error is interesting. I see that a little bit on mine. Like it'll show me on one of the tests that we take. It'll show me like, well, it kind of. I think what they're trying to do with it, the way it's been explained to me, is that like they give the range on there because they also want to account for like a kid having a good day or a bad day. Because dude, there's times too. Another reason I hate the standardized test. One of my students will come in, sit down, and like have a great score on a test, and then the next day they'll not. They'll
Yeah.
just, I don't
Yeah.
know. And part of that is because of sampling, right? Because sampling not in the sense of who they're testing, but sampling in terms of what the questions are. Because there are multiple times where it's like they give me this big curriculum, right? and they'll say, I want you to teach all of these concepts in 5th grade. And I'm like, okay, well, one, I got like 27 of those 30 concepts, whatever, you know.
And the 3 you didn't cover
the 3
comprise
I didn't cover,
90% of the test.
The 3 I didn't cover are the last 3 in the curriculum guide, and right after we take the test, right? So there's that, because it's like we got to take the test before we finish all the curriculum I'm supposed to do. So there's always going to be something left out. Because it's never on the last day of school. It's like with like a month left of school. So that's an annoying thing, right? And then there's the, like, they might do what you said. They might take a lot of questions from one concept that maybe I only went over for a week, but I went over another concept for like a month because I thought it was more important. And then there's like one question on the test about it or something. So it's also like there's a lot of biases and like just things that happen on those tests, or it's just like, it's not an accurate. It's like, I would say it's fair, or at least more fair, if standardized tests were only analyzed at like a high level, right?
Yeah.
Look at how all of the kids on the aggregate are doing. That might be a little more fair to the test. But when you look at when it gets down to the individual kid, it's like, dude, I don't know. This is not super accurate. And so I don't know. I have real issues with standardized tests that we've talked about before, but
yeah. I thought one that was really interesting along those same lines was another learning for me was that there are 2 different measures for inflation. And you could use one or the other. Like that kind of thing is so interesting, like, and kind of falls under the same lines, which is like, well, what are we talking about? Or like, what are we going to apply in this particular situation? And I recently saw this like in the news. There was some debate between like journalists and press secretary of the White House. Like they were like debating how like you should define inflation. And I thought it was dubious of the White House, but then seeing this, I was like, oh, maybe they were just using different measures legitimately. That's totally possible. And like, if you're not aware of that, you could easily be duped into just being like, oh, they have the definition. It's like, what definition? Whose definition? Yeah.
Did you have anything that you like strongly pushed back against or disagreed with in this chapter?
I'm just realizing, I was thinking about this as I was reading, especially with our feelings that we opened up with. My pushback is maybe just like, I wish that the author would provide solutions, and maybe he does towards the end of the book, because I think the 3rd section is about like how we can address things using the scientific method to avoid these lies. But I hope that he talks about that, because I'm wondering like, well, what's the antidote, or like, where is the hope? Because after reading this chapter, I did feel kind of like, oh man, I'm being duped by everything I've ever read.
I don't know, dude, because it's like, okay, we're in part 1 where it's talking about evaluating numbers. Part 2 says evaluating words, and part 3 says evaluating the world. So I don't know. We'll see. We'll see. But we'll see. That was my like takeaway for this chapter. Like, what am I going to do about it? I said, well, I'm likely never going to trust any subjective statistic ever again. And I tend not to trust statistics anyway, but right now I'm like not in the habit of asking myself immediately if it's like subjective or objective. So what I want to do is just make sure that I'm like taking a critical eye on like, is this statistic subjective or is it objective? Or does it make the claim to be objective rather than subjective?
Yeah. I like the challenge for my, like, what are you going to do about it? I really like the challenge at the end where he talks about like, if you hear a stat that says New Zealanders floss their teeth 4.36 times a day, you should ask the question, can this be known? And I really like that as a very simple question.
Yeah.
Like, that's just a good question for us these days. It's like, how could that be known?
Yeah.
And to like think through critically, like, well, how would you arrive at that conclusion? And like, then
Is
to
that
ask the
reasonable?
question. Yeah. And to ask the question, I think this goes back to the same thing that I said from the last chapter, which is like to ask the question of like, what do people want to believe?
Yeah.
You know, like, you see a number on CNN or a number on Fox News, and you know what people want it to say.
Yeah, I was gonna say
So
it's either what
you
people want to
automatically
believe
know.
or what other people want other people to believe.
Yes, exactly.
Thank you for joining us, book friends. Next week on the BFTTG pod, Jack and Weston, they're thinking good some more with you, our book friends. Check out the show notes or the description, comment section for a link to the book and any articles that we talk about in the show. Bye-bye, book friends.
Bye for this time, guys.
Do a good thing today.
I love you.
Love you too, dude.